Why is Russia attacking Ukraine? Ukraine wanted to join NATO and was getting too close with the West. Russia can't have that because Moscow is very close to the border and NATO troops and missiles on their border is scary. They did the same thing in 2008 when Georgia wanted to join NATO. Putin is willing to take all this flack from the world if it means no NATO on his border. Edit. This was just a quick type up. I didn't expect the post to get this many replies, but yes. It's not just about NATO. There is also the idea that Ukraine belongs to Russia. The resources in Ukraine. More control of the Black Sea. Pipelines in Ukraine. Etc. There's a lot of different reasons for Russia to invade Ukraine and none of them are justified. Putin is also giving a lot of different reasons for the invasion, from NATO aggression to a genocide in eastern Ukraine and neo-Nazi government. 1. Avoiding Ukraine getting into NATO and basically allowing the US and the West having a knife against Russia's heartland. 2. Expanding into a more defensible position, with no wide border against Ukraine or NATO and establishing itself along a river or on a more defensible position. 3. Ensuring its gas pipelines run freely. 4. Ensuring there is a mass of land in between NATO and Russian heartland. 5. Better control of Crimea and the Black Sea. Those are the main reasons as far as I am aware. Aside from the gas line, I think it's maybe related to post-Soviet relations? Forget about the Russian Empire, but maybe it's because Ukraine wanted to join NATO and distance itself away from its eastern neighbors, and I think Putin doesn't want a NATO state armed at his borders. He wants Ukraine to be a buffer state. If he's trying to revive the Soviet Union, empire stuff, I hope it doesn't work. Putin views the dissolution of the USSR as one of the most humiliating and damaging events in recent history and dreams of reviving the Russian Empire back to its former glory and relevance on the world. It is also important to remember that Putin is old and realistically doesn't have that many years left to rule before he is forced to retire or is displaced, and wants to have his name glorified and his legacy set in stone. Security is honestly a secondary concern. Ukraine was never even close to joining NATO, and any discussion about that was only revived after Putin invaded Crimea in 2014. Putin is using it to hide the economic downfall in his own country. As for why Ukraine, look no further. Ukraine ranks first in Europe in proven recoverable reserves of uranium ores, second in Europe and 10th in the world in titanium ore reserves, second in the world in explored reserves of manganese ores, 2.3 billion tons, or 12% of the world's reserves, second largest iron ore reserves in the world, 30 billion tons, second in Europe in mercury ore reserves, third in Europe, 13th place in the world in shale gas reserves, 22 trillion cubic meters, fourth in the world by the total value of natural resources, seventh in the world in coal reserves, 33.9 billion tons. Ukraine is an agricultural country, first in Europe in arable land area, third in the world by the area of black soil, 25% of world's volume, first in the world in exports of sunflower and sunflower oil, second in the world in barley production and fourth in barley exports, third largest producer and fourth largest exporter of corn in the world, fourth largest producer of potatoes in the world, fifth largest rye producer in the world, fifth in the world in bee production, 75,000 tons, eighth in the world in wheat exports, ninth in the world in the production of chicken eggs, 16th in the world in cheese exports. Ukraine can meet the food needs of 600 million people. Ukraine is an industrialized country, first in Europe in ammonia production, second in Europe's and fourth largest natural gas pipeline system in the world. 142.5 bln cubic meters of gas throughput capacity in the EU. Third largest in Europe and eighth largest in the world in installed capacity of nuclear power plants. Third in Europe and 11th in the world in rail network length. 21,700 kilometers. Third in the world, after the U.S. and France, in production of locators and locating equipment. Third largest iron exporter in the world. Fourth largest exporter of turbines for nuclear power plants in the world. Fourth world's largest manufacturer of rocket launchers. Fourth in the world in clay exports. Fourth in the world in titanium exports. Eighth in the world in exports of ores and concentrates. Ninth in the world in exports of defense industry products. 10th largest steel producer in the world. 32.4 million tons. Imagine, if you will, that Ukraine is Texas. Texas has a long Mexican, Spanish heritage. Imagine if in Texas there was a minority who wanted to secede from the U.S. and be independent, and a different minority who wanted to rejoin Mexico, while the majority wanted things to just be safe and stable. Now imagine the group who wants to rejoin Mexico rebels and takes part of the state. Texas sends in its National Guard to fight against the separatists who have taken part of its state. Now Mexico declares that the areas that are controlled by the rebels are independent from Texas and the U.S. and starts sending in its army, fighting against the Texas Guard and claiming the Texas Guard are the ones inciting violence. This is a very major oversimplification of a generational fight that probably goes back to at least the Sassanids. There is religion involved, with Kiev being very important to Russian Orthodox Christianity. There are economical reasons with gas access and natural resources extraction. There are political motives on both the average Russian side, Putin's side, and Ukraine's side and NATO's side. There are a bunch of warhawks wanting to show off their new toys. There are contracts that Afghanistan vacated that need filling. There is so much history that no one person can possibly learn it all. People have given you military strategic reasons, which are great, but really they're not the reason behind this. Ukraine and Russia have been at some sort of conflict for almost a millennium. Russia paints Ukraine as part of its empire. During the Russian Empire it was named Novorossiya and some it named Malorossiya, New Russia and Small Russia. But Ukrainians fiercely oppose this. Ukrainians want to be free of Russia. As of the last few years, Ukraine has grown greatly and started reaching towards the West. Putin has seen the pro-revolutions around his country and he's realizing that he needs to prove, one way or another, that countries like Ukraine, who have stepped away from Russia, who look for independence and a democratic government, are not going to fare well. I don't think he originally planned to invade. I think he wanted to put enough pressure on the West so they would give up great concessions for Ukraine. But the West didn't. The US moved out and said, "Do it, asshole," so he was stuck between two paths. Step back and be sacked for being weak. Or invade, doom all of Russia's existence and be sacked later on. He hopes that this military invasion will paint him as a hero in the future. Rest assured, Ukraine will not give up easily. Our artillery defenses have not been strong. And our anti-air isn't either. Luckily, this is where Russia is weak. They need to step into Ukraine, and that's where we prosper. Our land is absolutely perfect against land assaults with tanks, armor and troops. Soon you will be seeing videos of Russian tanks burning by the brigade. Ukraine, during Soviet rule, was called the breadbasket. If the USSR, the Soviets got a lot of their food, power, and money from what came from the Ukraine. Doesn't help that Ukraine Gov is pro-NATO, which Putin doesn't like because he wants to squeeze the entire former USSR dry again. Oil, food, money, land that isn't inhospitable wasteland. scare the UN and EU, and a close-by invasion to compensate for his skinny penis. Imagine Ukraine is like the more attractive and successful man that Putin's girl left him for. And he's an angry neckbeard. Putin knew he would win and West will not be able to support Ukraine here. No matter how hard the sanction, Putin will always have an upper hand as they hold a fuckload of oil, gas and minerals, and everyone wants that. For those who ask, why does Ukraine matter? This is why Ukraine matters. Ukraine. It is the second largest country in Europe by area and has a population of over 43 million persons. More than Poland by about 6 million. Ukraine ranks first in Europe in proven recoverable reserves of uranium ores, second place in Europe and 10th place in the world in terms of titanium ore reserves, second place in the world in terms of explored reserves of manganese ores. 3 billion tons, or 12% of the world's reserves. Second largest iron ore reserves in the world, 30 billion tons. Second place in Europe in terms of mercury ore reserves. Third place in Europe. 13th place in the world in shale gas reserves, 22 trillion cubic meters. Fourth in the world by the total value of natural resources. Seventh place in the world in coal reserves, 33.9 billion tons. Ukraine is an important agricultural country. First in Europe in terms of arable land area. Third place in the world by the area of black soil, 25% of world's volume. First place in the world in exports of sunflower and sunflower oil. Second place in the world in barley production and fourth place in barley exports. Third largest producer and fourth largest exporter of corn in the world. Fourth largest producer of potatoes in the world. Fifth largest rye producer in the world. Fifth place in the world in bee production, 75,000 tons. Eighth place in the world in wheat exports. Ninth place in the world in the production of chicken eggs. 16th place in the world in cheese exports. Ukraine can meet the food needs of 600 million people. Ukraine is an important industrialized country. First in Europe in ammonia production. Europe's two ends and the world's fourth largest natural gas pipeline system. Third largest in Europe and eighth largest in the world in terms of installed capacity of nuclear power plants. Third place in Europe and 11th in the world in terms of rail network length, 21,700 kilometers. Third place in the world, after the US and France, in production of locators and locating equipment. Third largest iron exporter in the world. Fourth largest exporter of turbines for nuclear power plants in the world. Fourth world's largest manufacturer of rocket launchers. Fourth place in the world in clay exports. Fourth place in the world in titanium exports. Eighth place in the world in exports of ores and concentrates. Ninth place in the world in exports of defense industry products. 10th largest steel producer in the world, 32.4 million tons. Ukraine matters. That is why its independence is important to the rest of the world. Ukraine. Forwarded message. 1. Russia has steadfastly, whether publicly or quietly, believed that the Soviet Union split means nothing. Putin does not respect Ukraine's sovereignty in the slightest. 2. Russia and Ukraine have always held a tense relationship. Separatists, probing borders, uncertain peace treaties, etc. 3. Putin wants NATO forces as far away as possible from Russia's border. Ukraine, perhaps fearing what is currently happening, have been seeking NATO inclusion for a while now, which would put NATO forces on the Russian doorstep. 4. Ukraine's rapid militarization has Putin believing he's backed into a corner. Whether that's a fabricated reason to invade, or the genuine spark that lit the fire, is hard to say. But Ukraine has been drafting heavily. which seems to have antagonized Putin ever so slightly. 5. Putin is a dictator. It's what they do. BC They're getting friendly with NATO and Russia can't have that. Also Ukraine has black soil, which is the most fertile soil in the world, and Russia has had a failing economy for years, so they want that. I know it is crazy to ask such question. Honestly, I should start watching the news. I honestly have almost zero knowledge of what is happening right now. My embarrassing question is Russia killing innocent people in Ukraine? Putin is a cunt. 2 cents. Putin is old-school KGB, brought up through the Soviet Empire. For him, ever since his days as a KGB sorter in East Germany, and even before, the enemy has always been the West. The most humiliating crime for him was the fall of the Iron Curtain and loss of all satellite states. There's also the time-honored tradition of Moscow's yearning to have a geographical buffer zone from the European bloc. Currently, no one really knows the endgame, though there's a good possibility he hungers for a return to his nation's former post-World War II glory. The pretext for invading Ukraine is the same bullshit Nazi Germany stated as the reason for invading the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. They are our people and we will free them back to us. It's Lebensraum's expansive ideal in a different coat, set out by a man at the age of 69 who might just be feeling it's now or never. What he is mortgaging it all on is his country's future. Because make no mistake, if this fails, then he will have a European Union on Moscow's doorstep for generations to come. Because Putin wants to forcibly unite all Russian people, similar to another dictator from the last century. The endgame here is Luhansk and Donetsk joining Russia the way Crimea did. It's shocking that we are seeing 19th century expansion in the 21st century from a world power, and the rest of the world will do nothing to prevent it. It's no wonder countries like Latvia, with a quarter of its population being ethnic Russian thanks to Soviet-era migration, are scared they will be next. Luckily, they're part of NATO, so should be safe. Putin will say Russia feels threatened by NATO, but that expansion is only taking place because Eastern European countries are terrified of this massive bear looming over them. Contrary to all of the gilded posts here that are parroting Russian disinformation, we don't know. They have many claims, but Russia has made so many claims, lied so many times, that there's no clarity on what the actual game plan is here. There are a lot of speculative reasons as to why. One of the more holistic ones being that they overplayed their hand and want back down. The theory is basically as such. When they initially made claims about NATO, and then demands, they expected to have them met. They expected things to be as permissive as it was with Crimea and Chechnya and the rest of their similar operations. As such, they were put in a situation where their prior plan completely fell apart and had to decide on a new route, and then the current events are a byproduct of that. Whatever the reason for the entire plan was, that they are either backed into a corner or their timetable is too restricted for them to slow play it. Anyone claiming that this has fuck all to do with NATO is just regurgitating propaganda. The annexation of Donbass from the Ukraine by Russia has been in the works for about, if not a decade. They have backed and funded and stoked Russian separatism, tried to install their own puppet leaders. They succeeded at what point, but then Ukraine basically revolted in response. And at that time Russia backed units, personnel, soldiers. Naming convention to recognize them is kind of ambiguous. Used rockets against civilians. And this is just a continuation of that. This isn't out of nowhere. This is not a NATO thing. Just like this wasn't about a genocide. Just like the troops Russia sent in were not peacekeepers. Putin openly declared in his speech that he fully intends to recapture all of the prior USSR territory. Everything else is just a pretext to distract. We won't know what the real reason is for a while, if ever. First of all, you should not be too afraid to ask this, because I can assure you almost no one, me included, knows the whole story. At the end of the Second World War, after the Soviet Union was instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany, how did the European countries respond? They formed an alliance basically against USSR, which increased members steadily, called NATO. Fast forward to splitting of USSR. The independent Soviet nations started joining NATO. Mind you, these are nations next to Russia, making Russia kinda insecure in case of a conflict. Since you see in the NATO alliance a clause says that an attack on any one of those nations is an attack on all of the NATO nations, and hence they will need to respond accordingly. NATO nations have been pushing for the joining of Ukraine as a NATO member for some time now. Mostly USA. Because you know who benefits a lot from getting a strategic position against USSR. A position such as the naval base in Ukraine. But now, why I think Russia is attacking Ukraine at this point. There is another clause in the North Atlantic Treaty which disallows a nation engaged in a conflict to join NATO. Putin very clearly spoke, saying that if Ukraine were to join in NATO, Russia would not endure it as it at their doorstep, not thousands of miles away from the Russian border. Hence Russia would rather fall into conflict now than risk giving USA a position at Ukraine. Which honestly, if we see the United States history, would later culminate into a conflict anyway. I would like to clarify that it is not Russia that is attacking, but Putin is. Please don't generalize this to the entire population of Russia. We do not want war, and we cannot stop it. We will be responsible for the ambitions of our president, whether we like it or not. This will have a very negative impact on our quality of living, and I'm so sad about it. Putin is a power-hungry dictator who thinks that Russia should own everything that they have owned. In the past, if every country would think like this, the whole world would be at war.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Aircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.